The session that we are about to start is another panel discussion. Yesterday evening we have one which was more about in and out matter, that is our psychology and the world, or the world of public life. Today we are more inward oriented. So when the program was almost finished, an idea came to my mind. I looked what is on Monday and Tuesday, and there was some 2 hours missing. Was one of the reasons that, well, it should be filled up with something nice before the gala dinner. And then what occurred, what I could recall from some of the conferences, that was called Meet the Senior meetings, and it was done a number of times also in Putusk. Usually it was a one-to-one type of dialogue. That is, one of our leaders would present, make sort of scientific autobiography, and then people, younger people, students, would ask questions. But well, the idea was that let's do it in a group, at the group level, and address some key questions about our association, which is about 50 years old. Now, it happens that here in this distinguished panel, there are some of us who can claim that they are fathers or mothers of the association. That is, they participated in all congresses at the birth from in 1972. This is the birth of the association. So John Barry and Patricia Greenfield are, let's say, the mother and the father of, among them, well, maybe there are multiple parents of our association, but others are not, are also have a long standing membership. That is, Michael Bond has been perhaps about 40 years or so, and I heard from Font that he was there in Aberdeen in 1982. That was also my first year of attending IACCP Congress. So altogether, it's perhaps about, the mean score would be about 40 years in IACCP. So that's much. And so people here, the panelists can talk about the past and what were the conditions when the cross-cultural psychology was born, and what was the context of it, and which needs did it respond by then, and then we move towards the presence and to the future. So where we are now, and where could we go, which is perhaps indeterminate, but we take one or another path, or let's say not waiting what will happen, but be actively controlling the future. So we'll start from the past, and there are some of the panelists who would like to address this issue about the context, the situation that, and which needs the newborn baby cross-cultural psychology satisfied by then, and in 1970s or so, and later on. So who will be the first? You, John, please.
Thanks, Franz. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hanging in. It's been a long but pleasurable day. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, a bit closer. I'm going to talk about early days in the 60s. Although some things, of course, happened in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I'm doing this because many of you are, well, you're all younger than me, for sure, but many of you are relatively new to the field and may be interested in knowing where we came from. So here's an outline of what I just want to share with you. First of all, it's probably a surprise to many of you how many books there were addressing issues in cross-cultural psychology in the 1960s. And I have a list, and you can just quickly look at them. I won't go in them in detail. And then some of the initiatives that led up to the founding of the association, including the Directories, and then some early meetings before the founding meeting. I want to say a few words about John Dawson, who pulled it all together and is recognized as the founder of the association. Then something about Walt Launer and the founding of the journal, and the Istanbul Conference in 1971, and then the founding conference, Hong Kong, in 1972. So I mentioned that there were many books published in the 1960s. I don't expect you to read them, 60s and 70s, but Campbell, Siegel, Campbell, and Herskowitz. Marshall Siegel is one of the presidents of our association. Douglas Price Williams, a British anthropologist, psychologist, published a reader in the field in the 1960s. Michael Cole, 1971, Cultural and Cognition. Barbara Lloyd, also anthropologist, psychologist combined, did a reader in Perception and Cognition Across Cultures. And then you can go down, Brislin, Launer, and Thorndike, Methods. Myself with Pierre Dazin, an overview of culture and cognition. Robert Serpell wrote a little textbook called Salt Culture's Significance on Behavior. Neil Warren did 2 volumes, edited volumes of essays by those of us who were active in the field. Philip Vernon, one of the great scholars of educational psychology, got into the cross-cultural field and did a book on intelligence and cultural environment. Pierre Dazin, a colleague from Geneva, did a book on Piagetian psychology, and Marshall Siegel wrote a textbook by himself in '79, Cross-Cultural Psychology, and then in 1980, the first 6-volume edition of the Handbook of Cross-Cultural Psychology. So there was a substantial amount of material available in the early days that you might not have been aware of. More recently, Walt Launer and I were responsible for editing about 40 books in the SAGE series on cross-cultural psychology and methodology. And this started with Marilyn Brewer and Don Campbell's book, Ethnocentrism and Intergroup Relations, one of my own, and of course the one you'll all recognize, Geert Hofstede's book in 1980 on culture consequences, right through until Festschrift for Harry Triandis, edited by John Adamopoulos and Yoshi Kashima, and that was the end of the series. This is just a selection. So if you want to trace the evolution of what was known, the books in the previous slide and in this one, I think, will give you a substantial overview. I worked with John Dawson in Edinburgh from 1963 to 66, and then in Sydney from 66 to 69. And we already had the idea that we didn't want to remain isolated for the rest of our lives, and we needed to find people who had an interest in the intersection between cultural and psychological phenomena. And what I did was to look at the literature, these books and some journal articles, and write to a number of people, a couple of hundred people who I could identify, all by airmail, getting answers back. You remember airmail? And then I compiled something called the cross-cultural directories. So about 200 individuals, and we created the first directory of cross-cultural psychological research. And we listed them, we cross-tabulated them, their addresses, postal addresses, their culture areas of interest and their psychological areas of interest, and some sample publications. And then there were later editions with Walt Launer and Jules Leroux in the International Journal of Psychology, and here's the cover page from the 1968, I think, or 69 version. And you can still have access to those. And then as a separate publication, there was a booklet produced in 1970 with Walt Launer, which was much expanded. So these, I think, are important historical records of who was doing what, when, and with whom. and how we found ourselves before the association was actually available to us. Early meetings, one in Abaden, organized by Herb Kellman and Henri Tauchefeld. Henri Tauchefeld, you know from his work on identity. And it was attended by a number of psychologists, including Harry Triandis, who was tasked with creating something called the Cross-Cultural Social Psychology Newsletter in 1968. So this is another strand of people finding each other. And then the following year, there was another meeting organized by Harry Triandis in Greece. And people who attended that were Otto Kleinberg, Wally Lambert, and Chidam Kachabasi, whose memory we honored yesterday. John Dawson, as I mentioned, was he was an Australian by origin, trained in the US and Australia, did his PhD with Henri Tauchefeld, Dr. Phil, D. Phil actually, at Oxford, and then went to work at Edinburgh, where I was, and we collaborated on research in Sierra Leone, and then when he moved back to Sydney, he arranged for me to join him there as a lecturer. And in 1970, in the Cross-Cultural Social Psychology newsletter, he published a proposal for the formation of this association. Very wide-ranging, and a key issue was it was for cross-cultural psychology, not of cross-cultural psychologists, because he wanted to find a place for everybody from whatever perspective and whatever discipline who had a shared interest in these issues. He received a number of very supportive responses, again by airmail, and decided to proceed with the formal organization. John Dawson was actually living on his boat in Sydney Harbour for 3 years before he moved to Hong Kong. There he is with his wife Judy on the left, my wife on the right, and my daughter there. So here he is very relaxed, but he was a rather agitated guy, very intense, but on the water and with a beer, he was a very relaxed guy. 1970, Walt Launer, picking up on these initiatives from John and the Directories, wrote to a number of people proposing that a journal called the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology be created. Walt and I have been working on the archives for the association, and last year when we were in my boathouse looking through some of the early correspondence, most of the letters he received in support of the idea of the journal were positive. There were two that were a bit hesitant, one from Harry Triandis and one from me. We weren't quite sure we were ready, but he went ahead anyway, and the first issue was published. And the journal, as you know, became part of IACCP later. In 1966, I thought I had a slide on it. James Drever, who was president of the International Union of Psychological Science, oversaw the creation of the International Journal of Psychology. The first issue was published in 1966. It had an explicit focus on cross-cultural research. It had articles by Gustav Yehoda and by Patricia and by myself, amongst others. So this was an important opening salvo in the publication explicitly of cross-cultural research. And the 50th anniversary issue, a virtual issue of that of the journal, was published last year, in which articles by Patricia and myself were both included. In 1971, Lee Cronbach, Mr. Alpha, and Peter Drenth, who was a major scholar in Dutch industrial organizational and assessment psychology, held a conference in Tarabya in Istanbul, in which many people whose names you will recognize attended. They included Chris Bakara from Nigeria, myself, Simon Bischoivel from South Africa, Lutz Eckensberger from Germany, Reuven Feuerstein from Israel, Jem Georges from Greece, Chidam Kachabasi from Turkey, Sid Irvine from Scotland and Canada, Wally Lambert from Canada, Don McElwain from Australia, Ipo Portinga from the Netherlands, and Henk van der Vleer also from the Netherlands. And really, this was the first time that most of us met in person. despite the networking through correspondence and networking through the directories, most of us had never actually come into personal contact with each other. So this was a seminal moment. John, as I mentioned, proposed the founding, and the first meeting was held in 1972. Jerome Bruner was named the first president. John Dawson simply named him. There was no election. Jerome lasted for a while and then decided to pass it over to Gustav Jehoda, who was our second president. Both of them, unfortunately, passed away this past year, meaning that the Archives project is particularly important because we hope to be able to include their papers in the archive. And John Dawson served as the first Secretary General. So people from all over the world went to that Hong Kong conference. Again, Chris Bakra, Alistair Mundy Castle, who by that time had the chair of psychology at the University of Lagos. Michael Okonji, also from Nigeria. Mallory Wober, who was with us in Edinburgh, but at that time was working at Makara in Uganda. Steve Bachner, Alistair Heron, Daphne Keats, Leon Mann, Ron Taft, Alison Turtle from Australia. You will probably recognize many of those. Fran Aboud, myself, and Sid Irvine from Canada. Elke Kroger and Bernie Wilpert, who was prominent in applied psychology from Germany. John Dawson, David Ho. You probably know David's work on indigenous psychology. India, Ananda Lakshmi and Professor Rath from Bhubaneswar. Iraj Ayman from Iran. You may know the work of his daughter, Roya, who's in Illinois, an industrial psychologist doing cross-cultural work. Yasumasa Tanaka, who was a friend of Harry Triandis and associate editor of the journal for a while in its initial stages. Dr. Hoshino. And from the UK, you may be surprised to see Jerome Bruner from the UK, but at the time he was chair of the psychology department in Oxford. Frank Heller, Barbara Lloyd, Helmut Morsbach, and Neil Warren were also present. And that's a duplicate. From the US, Rich Brislin, whose name you certainly know. Henry David James Fawcett, Harry Gardner, probably less well known to you. Patricia here, of course. Francis Hugh, the anthropologist, culture and personality. Alice Incalis, the sociologist concerned with social structure. Herb Kellman again, psychologist. Walt Launer, Tony Marcella, a clinical cross-culturalist. Marshall Siegel, June Tapp, Harry Triandis, James Whitaker, and both the Whitings, Beatrice Whiting and John Whiting. So a mixture of psychologists and anthropologists, all again, many of us meeting for the first time in person. And there is John Dawson striding purposefully across Hong Kong Harbour. He was not only a strict guy, he was also a military guy. He was in the British Navy at that time, responsible for the evacuation of Hong Kong in case of invasion. And most of us worried about the safety of us who might have been caught in Hong Kong, because he never seemed to be entirely with it. He was a very good organizer for the association, and I gather for the department in Hong Kong, but he unfortunately developed a neurological disorder, and he died relatively young. I'm meeting with his son actually later this year to bring him up to date on his demise, because he never remembered his father as anything other than a debilitated man. But in his prime, John Dawson was an amazing force, and we owe the foundation of the association to him. Okay, so that's a bit of prehistory right up to the time of founding that many of you may not have been aware of, and I hope it's been informative for you.
If some of you have encountered culture at this conference and feel as if you don't know what's happening, I want to share with you my life, which has been a process of discovering or hoping to discover and thinking at different stages that I have discovered what culture is all about and how we should be approaching it as psychologists. I arrived, as I've written in Japan in 1971, totally unprepared for my future. I knew no Japanese language, no anthropology, very little history. I'd had a mainstream psychological training and had diligently avoided in graduate school taking courses like anthropology and sociology and languages, dare I say, useful preparations and grounding. So I had to make it up as I went along. And for those of you who submit to the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, please be informed that my first submission was duly rejected. And I then had to figure out how to tell a story about culture. And if we take Santayana seriously, and to say that those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it, I'll share with you a couple of lessons which I think I've picked up over the years. The first one is that bicultural comparison of mean differences between people selected from two different cultural systems are useless. Second one is, and I should say that I made my early career doing exactly such studies. And then, of course, reflecting on what we had and what we didn't have. But my reflections and my discovery that these studies were not useful was based upon doing multicultural studies, which suddenly put my particular bicultural comparison base into context and made me realize that there are degrees of difference. Particularly sobering was discovering that Chinese values, the Chinese Value Survey, which we created and administered around the world to 23 different student samples, produced results that located the 5 Chinese cultural groups in our study in different space. There was no Chinese monolith, a story that I had been telling for many years based upon long, growing understanding of Chinese culture. So that was the first, that's the first lesson that has moved me into multicultural studies, where I think we should be going if we possibly can. The second lesson, for what it's worth, is nationology is not psychology. But we need one another, and we have to figure out how to use one another, and hence my discovery of late about the usefulness of HLM models, which allow us to unpackage cultural influences on individual level processes. And a third rather cheeky observation, lesson from history. This is 1982. I was at the cross-cultural conference in Aberdeen. And Pavel, Miles Houston and I drove a car, Miles's car in this case, from Aberdeen to Oxford, London, okay. Now the lesson I learned is never sit in a car with Pavel around a British roundabout. Miles Houston, who's still with us, had a small heart attack as he realized that the rules of the road observed by Pavel were different from the rules of the road observed by most British drivers. Now, there's more to say, but I'll leave it at that. We have other panelists, and I certainly hope that today we hear from you guys. Okay? You're the future, we're the past.
Okay, so I wanted to focus on changes that have occurred in the recent past. These shifts are visible at present and will continue to influence our field into the future. They fall into the following 3 themes: method and methodology, number one. Number two, integration of cultural and cross-cultural psychology. And three is organizational developments of the last few years. So first method. I have seen a shift in these last years away from methodocentrism. As cross-cultural psychology developed, it was defined in terms of large-scale comparative statistical analysis of samples from different countries. Although this method is still important, our field is no longer defined by one single method. Instead, we have multiple methods. First, there's a concept of problem-centered methods in which the issue and the context dictate the method. Secondly, there's an idea about concept-centered methods in which the measuring instrument is less important than the concept. For example, Peter Smith's wonderful talk yesterday, in which he combined different measures of individualism to assess an underlying and more general concept than what could be measured by any one specific method. We also have the idea in our field, and it's present at this conference, that a basic psychological concept can be manifest in multiple ways in behavior, only one of which is a response to a survey item. So for example, the concept of child obedience. Historically, that was measured in two important cross-cultural surveys, the Value of Children surveys and the World Values surveys. Both surveys measured the importance of child obedience to mothers across cultures. Well, this morning I saw a wonderful poster by a young researcher, Jeffrey Kwan, in which he used multiple methods to assess multiple manifestations of this same underlying concept. He did a cross-cultural comparative study that included maternal socialization of preschool child obedience, but his central measure was based on observing mothers actually interacting in a standardized situation with their preschool children. And he related this quantitative measure of quantitative measure of mother's use of commands in the interaction. That's a behavior that encourages obedience. He related that measure to a survey measure of the importance of child obedience to the same mothers. And he found that the same cross-cultural differences appeared on both levels, maternal behavior and the maternal survey, each manifestation reinforcing the other. I think this study is an example of one that uses multiple methods to assess multiple manifestations of the same underlying concept. Okay, now I want to move from method to my second major topic, and that's the integration of what was originally labeled cultural psychology with another field called cross-cultural psychology. I believe we now have a single field manifest in the last few IACCP meetings and in this conference. This field explores the manifold interrelations of culture and psychology and does so throughout the lifespan. So here I would like to present a little institutional history that's not well known, especially by younger researchers. In the year before the IACCP conference in Bremen, Germany in 2008, I was approached to join a cultural psychology mailing list and then asked to be president of a to-be-formed cultural psychology society. I hesitated. At the time, cultural and cross-cultural psychology were at war with each other, but I identified as both. So it happened that shortly after receiving this invitation to lead a new society to explore culture and psychology, I attended the IACCP conference in Bremen. At the final banquet, I sat opposite Walt Lahner, founder of the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology. Walt was incredibly upset at what he considered an insurgent movement that threatened the field he had done so much to build. Well, his reaction led me to consider the IACCP infrastructure that had been built with such devotion and care over the years. The journal, the conferences all over the world. Perhaps most important was the incredible efforts that IACCP had made to be truly international and to develop psychology and the study of culture and psychology in the majority world. I considered also, though, on the other hand, the intellectual excitement of cultural psychology and its incorporation as an integral part of social psychology. But I also considered its limitations, its domination by U.S. psychology. The Cultural Psychology Pre-Conference is part of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, a U.S. organization. It had some participation in East Asia, but not the rest of the world, unlike IACCP. So I realized that the two organizations were complementary. Each had its strengths and each had its weaknesses. And when I went home to Los Angeles from that IACCP meeting, I proposed that the Cultural Psychology mailing list become part of IACCP, with IACCP in turn opening itself up to cultural psychology. Veronica Benet Martinez and Michelle Gelfand were extremely helpful in making a partnership happen, and I think the meetings and members of both groups have become greatly strengthened by this partnership. Okay, number three. Number three is some trends in the organization that I've had a role in as president and past president, my current title. And these are trends that I think will contribute to a bright future for IACCP and the field. First, I want to mention the travel funds for regional conferences. That's something new, and I think it's extremely important in building capacity in our field in various regions of the majority world. And 20 awards were given for this conference, 20 travel awards. Are there any people here who got them? Oh dear. Whoops. Whoops. Okay, maybe I shouldn't have asked. Okay, great, yay. Another development that I think is important for field building that's new, the Kwok Leong Memorial Scholarships for the IACCP Summer School on Culture and Psychology. And I hope that many of you from Central and Eastern Europe will apply for summer school at Guelph, and many of you from other regions of the world as well. The third and last development is the Center for the History of Psychology in Akron, Ohio, in the United States, is going to be the site for IACCP archives. Under the leadership of John Berry and Walt Lahner, this repository of our records will ensure that IACCP is considered an important part of the history of psychology. But also our historical records, such as newsletters and conference programs, will be available to present and future generations of scholars in the history of psychology. So, in conclusion, as this conference shows so well, as the world becomes more global and more interrelated, IACCP becomes more relevant. Our capacity building around the world ensures that our relevance and importance can only expand, and I look forward to discussion with all of you.
Okay, so John mentioned a newsletter back in 1967, Triandis's project. That became the Bulletin later on. I was editor of the Bulletin for 17 years, from when I was young till recently. Okay. And so part of that, I looked for things to do with it, things to publish, and sometimes crazy stuff. And I was thinking, what is this organization about? Who are we? Who are these people? Who are you? What are we doing here? And it's not really a scientific society exactly. I mean, it's sort of a club, okay? It's different things. So I did a survey of the membership at that time. And it was published in this edition of the Bulletin, 2009 edition. I used to change the name of the Bulletin to different languages after conferences. I thought it was cute at the time. Now it doesn't seem so cute, but it was different back then. Anyway, so basically, we got a pretty good response rate. I would have wanted more. The title is based on my mentor, Douglas Adams. Maybe you know who he is, maybe not. He's a great philosopher of many things. Okay, so anyway, hence the title of the article. So a lot of good responses to it, a lot of good open-ended kinds of things. So this is one set of items, or sets of items, and involving different aspects of what we might be doing here. And I've underlined in red, kind of thin red lines, the basic concept of each line. So I was asking people, what are we here for? Why did you join, and are you happy with that aspect of the organization right now, 2009, obviously? So science, that was the main purpose for joining. 95% said it was for the science. Is it true? I don't know. The reason to join, purpose was 95%. The reason to join was mostly for the science. Satisfaction was not with the science. Oh, it's pretty close. It's kind of almost a tie, basically. Practice, not a lot of that, really, comparatively, compared to other organizations, of course. Social stuff, interaction, came out highest in satisfaction. But the reason mainly is people love our conferences. They say, this is great, this is different, it's fantastic, it's very warm, it's social, it's fun, it's different. The big shots will talk to you, actually, that kind of thing, and which is different than some organizations, obviously. For careers, some of that, basically to help, these were developing nations here, develop in some ways as kind of a outreach kind of a project, basically, to talk to people about other areas, other fields, basically, especially other nations and other kinds of things. So looking at the responses and trying to figure out what's actually going on here, it seems like we have 4 different bases for existing. I call them legs here. One leg is, of course, intellectual. But in the survey, there were a lot of complaints about that. I see some of you are here today. I can embarrass some people here, possibly with your responses to the survey. I've got them coming up. Social, I mentioned conferences just now. It was a great call for a Polish conference in the survey. Back in 2009, people said, give us a Polish conference. Do you believe that? I'm kidding, okay. No, that was 2009, okay. So, it's a joke, okay. Sorry. So basically wanting to help and work with people from majority nations, and that's another leg, I think, what we do, and also trying to change the world. Like most people in these fields, we're kind of change the world, Levine's concept of action research or save the world, save the whales kind of thing, and that's part of our DNA perhaps as social scientists, not just in cross-cultural psychology. So these 4 legs, I think, I interpreted the data to indicate what we're doing here. So science is number 1, but it's not the only thing here, and if we didn't do the rest, we wouldn't be around, I don't think. And if the conferences got kind of boring or stilted or something, that could be a problem with this organization looking forward. So I have the actual survey article here, and also I've got copies here. I think 20 copies I can give out of the survey result, this article basically. So I kind of tried to, I'm not sure it's going to show up here very well, tried to highlight some of the comments. This guy, okay, made a comment, okay, and try to highlight the gist of it, basically. The word culture should be highlighted too. I'm sorry. So this within this organization, cultural psychology movement, which was there from the very beginning, I think, in some sense, not just amongst the American social psychologists more recently. Colleen Ward, Ron Fisher's group in New Zealand issued a statement, like a joint statement, basically, and they're saying we should be more modern, we should change, we should do more different things, and so on, not to be stuck in the rut of what we're doing at that time, basically. Is Valerie here? Valerie Cherkov? He's at the conference. I don't see him here today. He's also a self-described cultural psychologist, and so he's making a point here that's moderately strong. Dusty, century-old, those kinds of things. So Gentlemen's Club is kind of a tough one, basically, and talking about kind of like the informal power structure of the organization in some ways. Ipa's not here, but he talked about also the idea of not, this is 2009, not new ideas coming through. I think that's changed since then, but that was a sense of some people at that time. Geert is not here, obviously. And he was pointing out something else. Dominique Auguste didn't come this time either, talking about a particular area, cognition, as an area we should look into. Forrest Tyler is not here. I haven't seen him for a while, actually. And he wrote a long essay, basically. So he also is a self-described cultural psychologist, actually. So several people spoke up. It's a minority, it's probably 20% of the group at that time was cultural psychology, I would say, roughly, or self-described cultural psychologists. What that means now is not clear to me anymore, but it meant something for a while, at least. So I was looking at typical cultural qualitative research kinds of arguments here, basically. This is a dance party, and well, I've got that. I should have brought that photograph out, that classic photograph. This was one of George Bush's favorite words. That's why I put it there. It was funny at the time. Now it means nothing to people. So anyway, Robin Goodwin didn't come this time. Talking about the social aspect, finding colleagues to do work with and so on. Floyd Rudman, always a strong critic of many things, talks about some of the social dynamics of the organization there too. Anonymous person, maybe this person's here today. Klaus is here. It wasn't you, one of your students. Talked about loving the conference, basically. So the feeling basically was that the science was good but not great. The social stuff was great. The practicality was not well met yet, at least not in the field, not in the mainstream part of the field. But anyways, the overall picture here is a kind of a compound organization. It's not, I mean, it's scientific for sure, but it's more than that. And it has to stay that way, I think, to be successful in the future. I have some great pictures of people dancing in my archive of dancing pictures, including him. Is Chuck here? Oh, you're right there in front of me. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, it just sort of shrinks. I have a great photo. Never mind. But anyway, so that's my comment. So thank you.
I would like to take a closer look at the discipline in general and how are we doing. And I would like to do that on the basis of a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Very brief, my interpretation of what's going on there. So first of all, I think where we are now, I'm very much future-oriented. It's quite clear that there is an amazing interest in the topic. What John mentioned about, is it viable to establish a journal in those days, was an important question. We have moved beyond that stage, much beyond that stage. And if you look at, for instance, the number of publications dealing with cross-cultural psychology, specifically cross-cultural psychology. I'm not talking about economic studies about cross-cultural differences, not talking about sociological, not about educational. What's listed in PsycInfo. If you want to keep update, you have to read about 8 articles per day. That's where we are now. Yeah? So the field has gained, if not in quality, then at least in quantity. So there's a lot to learn from the literature nowadays. But you also see it in the development of IACCP. Last year's conference in Nagoya was the largest ever we've had, even though Japan is not very inexpensive. Yeah? This is one of the largest regional conferences we've ever had. And what you also see, and I think that's very important, is the whole idea, and Patricia already mentioned it, reaching out to other people. In this conference, the largest group is from Poland, the second group is from Germany, and the third group is from the Russian Federation. And I think that's very important. That is where we have not been before and where we should be. Yeah? So an important part of our mission is to bring cross-cultural psychology to parts of the majority world, to parts of the world where we have not been before. And we seem to be doing reasonably well. And I think that there is no reason to assume that the interest in cross-cultural psychology will diminish. By the way, it's important to realize that all of us together produce a tiny fraction of these 8 publications per day. Cross-cultural psychology has become a specialization that's mainly done by people working in other fields who happen to become interested in cross-cultural differences. And in many cases do 1 or 2 studies and then return to mainstream comparisons. Okay. Do we have weaknesses in our field? Yes, more than we like. I found it unfortunate that our field is dominated by social psychology. There's so much more in the field than social psychology. I think we do not have enough linguistics in our field. We do not have enough ethnography in our field. We do not have IO psychology. Many more things that could be better developed. And I think we also have some biases. And we did a comparison of types of studies published in Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology. And what we found there is that as cross-cultural psychologists, we are way more interested in differences than in similarities. Chuck was giving a presentation this afternoon where it turned out that when it comes to marriages, arranged marriages and romantic marriages, similarities prevail. We know from other studies that it's often the case. What we do in our publications is that we tend to emphasize the differences, not the similarities. And if we find a similarity where we expected the difference, there's a problem with the data, or with the sample, or with something else, not with our theories and our models. I think that's very poor. Yeah, I think we can and we should do better. That bias has been around for quite a while, but we seem to be difference-geared in our approach. What are the opportunities? Clearly, overcoming the duality between individual and culture, integrate many more perspectives, linguistics, anthropology, many different perspectives. The reference here to Bronfenbrenner is not entirely random, because I think that developmental science, probably more than any other field in psychology, has been able to integrate different perspectives and has been integrated the different systems, the macro system, exosystem, etc., all the way down to the individual. I think it's the best example of how you can integrate different levels of analysis. We start out, and there's always an intrinsic tension in our field, we start out as psychologists. But we are not interested in psychology, we're interested in cross-cultural differences and similarities, which means that by definition, we are also interested in another level. But we are focused, and that's Michael's story, I was prepared for the individual level, I was not prepared for the other level. Yeah? But it's crucial for our field that there are these levels, and I think it's very encouraging to see that in the last decades, there are more and more important opportunities to combine levels. Michael was referring to multi-level modeling. That's just a statistical approach, but there are also conceptual approaches where you do this. Okay, then the threats. The main threat, I think, is the long-term viability of the field. We are going to celebrate 50 years of cross-cultural psychology in the near future. Are we going to celebrate 100 years of cross-cultural psychology in the long term? What is the long-term viability of our field? Now, there are all kinds of possible threats along the way, but I think one of them is that they are, say, what are possible scenarios, and obviously this is a thought experiment, what are possible scenarios for the long-term development of cross-cultural psychology? And the first is, a very ambitious one, that we have achieved all our goals. That cultural factors have become part and parcel of all psychological theories. If that is the case, there's no point in doing cross-cultural psychology, because cross-cultural psychology has then become integrated in the rest of psychology. I do not think it's very likely, but in principle it could happen. And that is what Walter Lohner called the death wish of the field. We wish to die in this way because it means mission accomplished. The second one is that mainstream psychology loses interest and the field becomes marginalized. What I think is very important for the existence of cross-cultural psychology is that we have models of cross-cultural differences. That we have ideas where cross-cultural differences come from, and that we can locate them at the individual level, things that are going on at the cultural level. At some point in time, if we are no longer able to develop new models, new approaches, we will become dry, infertile, whatever you want to call it. Yeah? That may be the end of the field. A third argument is one that has been expressed quite a few times, which I think is quite remarkable, and that is that globalization could reduce the interest in cross-cultural differences. Now, if globalization has shown anything, it is the opposite. Globalization means that there is some reduction in cross-cultural differences, but there is also a tremendous increase in cross-cultural differences. The old ones remain and new ones are being added. I live in the Netherlands. If you go to a concert in the Netherlands of a very modern pop group, they will combine the latest fashions in American music, in US music, with a local dialect. That is also globalization. Yeah? And obviously there's a lot of interest in this kind of thing. So I don't think it's very likely, if anything, the opposite will happen. And finally, it may be possible that new subfields are taking over. I'm not sure whether you're aware of the work in geographical psychology. Without any theory, they take regions and look for cross-cultural differences, for instance, in personality. Has mainly been done in personality. Different regions in the US, different regions in the UK have been described. Huge samples, all internet-based, and that's called geographical psychology. And that's on purpose a descriptive type of psychology. No explanations offered whatsoever, just a description of what are differences in personality. I don't see any likely candidate to emerge, but it could happen that we become all absorbed in a new discipline, for instance, that integrates ethnography, linguistics, etc., together with cross-cultural psychology. Okay, thank you very much.
Now we open up the floor for questions. And you could hear about institutional history or institutional past, also personal history, personal professional history and past. You could hear about changes within the association and new trends. You could hear about possible future scenarios, what can happen with the association. You could hear about why members of the association are motivated to be members. So there were many different topics, but of course we don't know what your interests are. So please ask your questions.
A question to Joan. In your review, you didn't mention the Inter-American Association of Psychology, and my understanding is there is a earlier relationship between the earlier cross-cultural group and that association. I just wanted to know if it was the case or not.
You're right. I've been involved in both associations. I only occasionally now go to them, having retired and getting no funding. But I will be going to the next one. And there are some members of this association and the Applied Association who are quite active in the Inter-American. The Inter-American Association for CIP, as it's called, Sociedad Interamericana de Psicología, is an attempt to bring together peoples of the Americas, much like the OAS, the Organization of American States, American meaning everybody in the Americas, in part driven to find themselves in a space dominated by APA psychology, to avoid total domination. So in that sense, it's an indigenous psychology approach. Who are we as a people of Spanish, French, and other indigenous origins that can reflect on ourselves? Now, it might be of interest to know that there is a new association, the Caribbean Regional Federation of Psychological Associations. There are 40 territories and countries in the Caribbean. They have been colonized by 5 different language groups. They all experienced slavery and decolonization and or neo-colonization. They all share certain psychological issues and concerns, and yet they never got their act together until 3 years ago. Now we have a very vibrant regional association, and it's been sponsored in part by IACCP. So this is somehow we can move in the future. In late November this year, there's a similar one in Hanoi, which I'm going to provide opportunities for international networking for Southeast Asian regional psychologists. So our association indeed has links to CIP, to the Caribbean, and to Southeast Asia. There was a meeting we participated in Africa as well. So yeah, we have these links, and they're very important features of our work.
I want to say something about Latin America. When I became president, I was given the mandate to increase participation from Latin America in our organization, because that's definitely been a regional weakness. We did have a regional conference in San Cristobal de las Casas in Mexico, a region that I've been doing research in since the late 60s. But what I want to mention is I think the real capacity building regional conference will be our next regional conference, which is almost set. We're just waiting for a revision of a proposal from the University of Costa Rica. And they really, unlike Mexico or the southern Mexico, the University of Costa Rica has a wonderful group of cross-cultural psychologists who are organizing this. One problem with getting people from Latin America involved is Spanish, because that's a big language area, and they have a hard time with an all-English conference where they're not able to use their language. This one will have some Spanish symposia as well as English symposia, so I expect that it will really be an important one for integrating people from Latin America into IACCP, and I hope that many of you will be able to come. Costa Rica is a great place to visit. The University of Costa Rica has a beautiful campus. It has wonderful facilities for us, and so I hope many people will participate.
Somewhat of a question, but somewhat of a comment to what Fons was bringing up, which is how do we ensure that we're not going to be marginalized as an association, and will we fail to materialize what we can offer? And one of the conversation points I had with John just yesterday was it would be nice to see IACCP, now so well grounded and well developed with its methodology, going into those national associations, rather than vice versa, to have streams, to offer cross-cultural psychology methodology sessions, because as Bill and I have attended, for example, PSYOP multiple times, and we just pulled our hairs out when psychometricians, IO psychologists, industrial organizational psychologists, are known to be really well versed in psychometrics, but not in cross-cultural works, and they are as though reinventing the wheel and making a lot of enormous amounts of errors in their understanding. It would be nice if we could go into the EWOP and the PSYOP, and in fact, just in industrial organizational psychology, PSYOP, which is Division 14 of the APA, EWOP, which is the European Association of Work Organizational and Personnel Psychology, and IAAP, Division 1, have created an alliance of organizational psychology, but none of it is cross-cultural in its focus, which I think is a shame, and I think it's an opportunity for IACCP to have some place and have some voice in that type of association, so we could see more IO psychologists coming to as well IACCP. And I'd like to throw out to Saba the opportunity maybe to consider having streams on certain days. This is the developmental psychology stream, this is the IO psychology stream, this is the social psychology stream, to consider having a day like that so that people can find other people within disciplines who are doing cross-cultural and can start building and developing social support networks with each other in the works that they're doing.
If I may react to that, I think that there is a growing interest in other associations to become involved in cross-cultural research. I'm going to present a workshop in October for IO psychologists related to the European Association in Florence. So they are interested. But I think your point is well taken, that we could do more, and we should probably do more to reach out to other associations. It may well be that some are pretty open for these initiatives, but it's definitely worthwhile to pursue this. Yeah. By the way, the APS has invited us a few times to organize special symposia. That's not entirely a workshop, but special symposia about cross-cultural issues. These were pretty well attended, so that's one way of reaching out to a slightly different audience that is by and large strongly mainstream oriented.
From my view, cross-cultural psychology must pay much more attention for problems of intercultural interaction, intercultural dialogue, sharedness formation. Because in this up-to-date situation, we see conflicts, we see misunderstanding, and for me it's especially important practical participation of cross-cultural association for helping in these conflicts, these misunderstanding solutions. And as I know, you only started to research such problems as intersubjectivity, but it's processual thing. It's necessary to understand mechanisms which are on the basis of these processes. And of course, a very important problem is mutual intercultural understanding. We must understand that there are a lot of differences, cultural differences, and how form such sharedness, including contextual, hidden part of cultures. And when we discuss in future perspectives of cross-cultural psychology, we must think about this. Thanks.
Can I just respond? Yesterday at the session at this time, there was a discussion of a project called Mutual Intercultural Relations, and I presented the idea that there are some basic psychological principles that we can research and then try out to see whether they work in order to promote better intercultural relations. A lot of what you'll find in this program, I think, if you go through it in detail, whether explicitly or implicitly, is dealing with what can we do as psychologists to isolate the core processes that are involved, and can we use knowledge about these processes to improve intercultural relations. So I entirely agree with your point. I think we have already started down that road, and I hope we will continue.
Well, of course, there is a field of intercultural communication, which has as its stated mission to look at interaction across cultural difference. A field that, from its beginning, really has used information from ethnography, from cross-cultural psychology, and other sources. As many of you in the room know, there was an effort, when was it, a decade ago, John, of the construction of the International Academy of Intercultural Relations. And the purpose of that organization was explicitly to create a marriage between the people who are doing cross-cultural psychology, this organization, and the people who are doing intercultural communication, which really was coming out of communication theory and based on some other notions. But the two clearly are complementary, if not synergistic. And I was wondering if you might comment on what you think the future of the relationship is between cross-cultural psychology and that academy.
I was against their formation. There's no need for a second organization or a third organization. The academy, it's CTAR broken apart. Or CTAR is still around, it's a big organization. They were the researchers in CTAR who couldn't stand the trainers. And basically, the trainers, yeah. Who was the editor of the journal?
Society for Intercultural Training and Research.
No, I mean the editor of their...
Dan Landis.
It's kind of Landis's project, mainly, so...
David Sam is the new incoming president of the association and a good friend of many people here in our association. And we have agreed that we will cooperate more closely in a number of projects. By the way, what I would like to add is that when it comes to intercultural communication, I think it's very important to make a distinction between different levels at which it is applied. Much intercultural communication deals with IO psychology, deals with organizations, deals with NGOs. But there is also the level of conflicts between nations or huge conflicts between ethnic groups within a specific country. And I'm not sure that they deal with the same dynamics. And I have heard many people referring here to recent populist movements. And I'm not sure that from cross-cultural psychology we have a very clear answer as to what's going on there. I've heard different analyses why Trump has been elected. We do not converge in these analyses. And in all fairness, I'm not sure that we have very much to say. If we have anything to say about it, it would be together with people from political science. Chris Gray gave a presentation this morning, and they obviously also have something to add there. So I think there are limits to what you can do as a essentially psychological association to deal with these issues. Yeah, and it would be good to join forces with people from communication theory and many other fields to see what can be done. But it would be quite a different approach from what we are doing now. Still, I think we should not underestimate the value, even the economic value, of intercultural communication in a business context. Yeah, there are many people earning a very decent living by training people who are involved in intercultural communication in businesses. Which is a very important applied field.
And this is one of the things I wanted to ask for, because another applied area that is actually very close to all of us in this room is international students, or not even just international students, but integrating kids in schools, primary and secondary, who are now notably more non-national than national, or at least, you know, there are these kind of enclaves. And what I discovered in Ireland is that there are a lot of structural curricular barriers to even train the new trainers, the new teachers, in anything to do with cross-cultural psychology. Like, you know, they barely squeeze in educational psychology. Bring in cross-cultural psychology, I think it's another elephant and it doesn't fit, while it is the elephant in the room in those situations. And then the other thing is, at the third level, we are desperate, really desperate, because we are incompetent. We are not trained, most of us not even as teachers. We are hired based on research rather than pedagogy. And we are going to soon be funded by international students in the Western world, at least. You know, there's a hunting for the international student fee. So I think that, or I'd like to suggest that as an organization, we might become a bit more active, very close to home. You know, just me, myself, and I back home, without really having to delegate much, without really having to learn another language altogether, or talk to political scientists who are, you know, already so far away from this field, you know. Yeah, so that was my question, you know, what do you feel about interacting more with educational settings at all level of education, but perhaps, you know, because it's closer to us, the third level, which is, yeah, but not only, so that's...
I want to respond to that. I've recently put in a proposal to the International Journal of Psychology for a special section on cultural mismatch in diverse populations, diverse settings. And so there's going to be an open call. And you know, I hope people here will submit proposals. But I'm planning to, I've structured it so there would be cultural mismatch on the family level, cultural mismatch in educational institutions, cultural mismatch in services like social welfare and therapy services. And also it's going to be international in the sense of dealing with cultural mismatches in many diverse populations. So if you have something to contribute to it, I hope to see a proposal for you. Yeah, well, we are working at home, planning to contribute some of, you know, a few things from our lab where we're working on cultural mismatch of especially Latino first-generation students in terms of the culture conflict between family obligation and academic obligation, which is a big one. And I think all the authors that have indicated so far that they would be interested, they're all working at home with different diverse populations in schools or other settings in their own country. But the countries of the researchers will be very diverse.
I take the opportunity in the last minute to say that it's interesting because there are these demands that probably cross-cultural psychologists should be more involved in helping solving political issues, I mean, understanding international conflicts, also in education. So this is a scientific association, but probably we could think about setting up such expert forces, you see, who can be advisors, international expert forces who can be advisors in such highly demanding social issues. Because I am sure each of us are doing this individual basis. You see, you are invited as an expert to a company to say something. You are invited as an expert to a school to say something. But it's individual. and not necessarily takes into consideration the latest research results or trends or what way it is the best to approach such a question. It is an individual perspective and not a group perspective consisting of different members coming from different cultures and different backgrounds. So this could be another role, but we are speaking about future. So, or of course we were speaking about the past, but also we have to think about the future. Maybe we could think about something like this, because I think this would be really a responsible role. And in fact, why do we do science? We do it very nicely because it's interesting, it's intellectually challenging and all these. But finally, aren't we social scientists who want to improve the society around us? And if we have serious answers or we believe that our answers can be helpful, then I think we should take that role and do that. Yes.
Well, just a word, just to round it up, or maybe especially Fons would like to say the last word also as a president, or the president of the association. I think that the past is not always very well known, but from what John said, I think that we know pretty well now, or better than before, about the circumstances of which led to the emergence of IACCP in the 60s, in the 1970s. And the future is unknown, is unpredictable, but there may be some scenarios. It was interesting, the SWOT model, or the SWOT approach, which you presented, Fons. Well, we are it is a European conference, and one thing which worries me a little bit is not that much the fact that we are more or not that many members in the IACCP, because it's different times. Formal membership is not necessary. But I would like to share with you something which has to do with the future. Well, how many important centers of cross-cultural psychology do exist in Europe? Going, let's say, from the east, that would be definitely Moscow. We are here in Warsaw. There is Tilburg, there is Bremen.
Robin Goodwin's operation.
Yeah, that was the University of Brunel. Yeah, you may mention some few others, but also during my active professional life, I know that some in Germany, like for instance in Regensburg, or in Lyon in France, or in Lund in Sweden, departments, groups, labs were closed down. So it worries me that we in Europe, well, let's just concentrate for a moment on this continent, that important centers of research, of applications are not growing, and it seems that that we do not grow in a qualitative sense, that there are important centers, or that students may learn cross-cultural psychology. And well, for instance, in this university, clinical psychology, the typical, the prototypical field of our discipline is absolutely #1. Then there goes business and cross-cultural psychology. Well, there may be some people interested, but it's a majority, it's a minority thing. So it seems to me that it is among the weaknesses, the situation that we do not have enough strong centers or such beacons on the map that would well, give directions and maybe contribute to spreading, to mushrooming our our field into to cover more parts of the continent and contribute to solving the problems.
May I react to that?
Maybe you could close with...
Okay, very good. I'm not sure that I share the premises of your analysis. Of course, I've shared the results of your analysis, but the premise is based on the fact that the discipline grows by centers that become bigger. And I'm not sure that is the way we grow. That may work for some disciplines, sure. But I think that the last 45, 50 years have also shown that you can grow in a different manner. And that cross-cultural psychology is a relatively small discipline. Look at PsycInfo, look at the number of publications about cross-cultural psychology, you will find that the absolute number is small. Now, if there's a small number, it's unlikely that you will have a vibrant center, that you will have vibrant centers in multiple places. What you see in the history of the field, as far as I know it, is that different places have been important in different parts of the history. However, what is common is that there are always these centers and that there are always these people who have an interest. And if you look from the very beginning to now, I think it's largely a success story. If you hear the stories by John about how it was set up, and if you look at it where we are now, it's amazing where we are now. There are more and more countries where cross-cultural psychology is part of the curriculum. You can call it cultural, you can call it cross-cultural, but in many cases it's a compulsory part of the education of a psychologist. That has been achieved. And in many cases, these courses are offered by people whom we do not meet here. Yeah? So, but that's also the advancement of the field. So your model would be a very nice model if it would work. And it may work for if you're in physics, if you work in medicine, if you work in these very large disciplines. But apparently it's not the way in which it works for cross-cultural psychology. If we have been able to grow and prosper, more would have been possible. But if you look where we are now, compared to how it started, it's amazing where we are now. It's amazing that so many people have become interested in cross-cultural issues. And that does not mean that we still exist in 50 years from now. I'm not even sure that's desirable to exist for such a long period of time. But I think the history has shown that the discipline is resilient, and that there are many people who are interested in these issues. And as long as there are people who are prepared to take up the torch, yeah, and who are prepared to do studies, come up with interesting results, are prepared to teach their students about these issues, I think we are in pretty good shape. And that is what I see. Although I share your view that centers come and go, but I don't think they are vital for the discipline.
I just want to say something. I think that the integration of culture into psychology is what's important. This is going one step further and building on what Fons has said. And I've seen it, for example, in my area at UCLA, which is developmental psychology, but now virtually everybody integrates cultural issues into development and socialization. So it's not something apart, it's intrinsic, and I think that's where we want to go, rather than isolating it.
I have a brief comment. Looking back on where we came from, I believe the original intention was to create a network, not centers. And we have a network with an organizational structure that supports the network. Centers often ossify, they become moribund, and then the interest disappears. But as long as we have committed individuals all over the world who are prepared to meet and enjoy each other every few years, I think the field's in good shape.
Thank you. I would like to make a closing comment. The symposium here I don't think that anyone knew exactly what to expect. I definitely did not know exactly what to expect. I found it very interesting to see a rich variety of presentations, partly dealing with the discipline, partly dealing with our organization, partly reflecting, partly looking at the future. I think the bottom line is that we seem to be doing relatively well. There are always major challenges. I very much appreciate your stamina to stay until 7:10 in the evening, given that the first presentation started here at 8:30 this morning. And I think we are all now very ready for the gala dinner. Thank you very much.